All right, welcome to the deep dive. I think as someone into philosophy, you're probably no stranger to really grappling with some of those big, just foundational ideas. And today we're going to be diving into one that's central to like all of modern biology, but also sparks a ton of debate, like philosophical debate. We're talking about biological information.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. This isn't just about, the science itself. It really gets into how we think about meaning, about function, and even like what it even means to be alive. So what we want to do in this deep dive is unpack this whole idea of biological information. And to help us do that, we're going to be leaning on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this topic. I think for someone with a philosophical mind, it's really cool to see how this idea of information kind of forces us to bridge the gap between biology and philosophy.
Absolutely. And so during our time together today, we're going to explore the different ways biologists and philosophers have approached this whole idea of information. And we're going to look at it at all these different levels of life, like how it works from the tiniest scales, like the information in our genes, all the way up to how animals use things like alarm calls to communicate. And as we go, we'll definitely be pointing out some of the big disagreements, the different perspectives that people bring to the table. It's complicated stuff, but it's really, really rich for philosophical thinking.
And as we go through all of this, it's good to keep in mind that the sources we're looking at, they don't all agree. They have a bunch of different views, and our goal is to kind of present those to you in a neutral way so you can follow the conversation and maybe even see where you land on some of these issues.
Okay, so to get started, let's just think about how much we use the word information when we're talking about biology. I mean, it really seems to pop up everywhere, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, think about it. At the molecular level, you've got all this talk of translation, transcription, the genetic code. It's all framed in these informational terms. And then when you zoom out to cognitive science, it's all about neural signals, mental representations, all carrying information. And like you said, we understand animal communication as these signals that carry information about predators, food, social status, the whole nine yards. Heck, even within a single cell, hormones and signaling molecules are thought of as transmitting information along pathways. It's kind of mind-blowing how deep this idea of information goes in biology.
Yeah, it almost feels like information has become like the go-to way of explaining how life just works, unfolds. But like this ubiquity, it makes you wonder, right? It raises some pretty deep questions, especially for a philosopher.
You're absolutely right. One of the first things that comes up is whether information actually means the same thing across all these different areas of biology. Is the information we talk about in the genetic code really the same kind of information that's happening when a bee does its little waggle dance to tell other bees where to find nectar? And maybe even more fundamental, is this information in biology a real thing, like a property of the world waiting to be discovered? Or is it more like a convenient, maybe even metaphorical way for us to make sense of these crazy, complex processes?
That's a huge question for philosophy, right? Are biologists discovering some inherent structure, some informational structure to life? Or are they just describing what they see in a way that makes sense to us? So, in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, they start by laying out two basic ways of thinking about information in biology. Let's dig into those a little bit.
So the first way they talk about is information as an epistemic tool. Basically, this is when we as observers can pull information out of biological systems, but the system itself isn't actually using that information in any functional way. Think about it like this. By analyzing how genes vary within different groups of organisms, we can learn about their evolutionary history, maybe even figure out how they're related on a family tree. Similarly, the rings in a tree trunk, they give us information about the tree's age, about the environment it lived in.
It's like we're reading the biological world for clues. The tree's not purposely making those rings to tell us its age, and genes aren't evolving in specific ways just to narrate evolution. We're the ones interpreting those patterns, right?
Right. So the biological thing, whether it's a bunch of squirrels or an old oak tree, it's not using that information in any active way. The encyclopedia calls this an inferential use of information. It's like we're using these features as evidence to learn about the world, kind of like how, a historian might study old pieces of pottery to learn about the people who made them. The pottery itself wasn't trying to say anything across the centuries. We're the ones giving it meaning.
That makes sense. So when we say genes contain information about like our ancestry, that's what we're talking about. The genes aren't trying to tell us a story, but we can sort of decode it from their structure. Now, the second way of looking at biological information, this one seems to get a little closer to how we normally think about living things.
Yeah, this one's information as an intrinsic property. Here, the information is actually part of the biological thing itself. Think about the electrical activity in your brain. How those patterns of neural firing seem to be about something in the world, they represent something. Or think about how molecular biologists talk about codons in DNA as coding for specific amino acids. There's this strong sense of instruction there, like it's directing the cell to build certain proteins. And when a monkey makes a specific alarm call because it sees a snake, it doesn't feel like we're just making up the meaning. The call itself seems to be about the snake, like objectively.
Yeah, there's a feeling of real content in these cases. It's not just random noise, it's about something specific. The codon isn't just a bunch of molecules, it specifies a particular building block.
I bet this idea of inherent meaning is especially interesting from a philosophical perspective. Definitely. This idea of information as something objective, like a property of the biological thing itself, is what's really captured the attention of a lot of philosophers and scientists. It's this aboutness, this instructional content that they're trying to figure out.
Okay, so we've got these two big ways of thinking about information in biology. Now, when biologists are talking about this second way, about information as an intrinsic property, are there any common features they tend to point to?
Yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia folks, they lay out some characteristics that are often used as a starting point. They say that this intrinsic biological information is usually seen as asymmetric, normative, and non-ubiquitous.
Asymmetric, normative, and non-ubiquitous. Let's break those down a bit for our philosophically minded listener. So what do they mean by asymmetric in this case?
Asymmetry basically means that the informational relationship doesn't work the same way in both directions. Think about that monkey alarm call again. The call tells other monkeys about the snake, but the snake itself doesn't carry information about the call. It's not like the snake is somehow signaling back to the monkeys. The informational content flows one way.
Yeah, that fits with what we normally think. The call is a response to the snake. It's meant to make other monkeys do something. The snake is just part of the environment. Okay, what about normative? That's a heavy word in philosophy.
It is. So when we're talking about biological information, normative means that we can judge the information against some standard of correctness, like is it accurate or not? For example, that alarm call, it can be right or wrong. If there's no snake, the call is basically false. It's misleading. Same with a codon in DNA. It's supposed to code for a specific amino acid. If the cell messes up and puts in a different amino acid, we can say there's been an error, a norm's been violated.
So there's a right way and a wrong way for the information to be, like, encoded or used. That's pretty different from just pure physical interactions, which are just what they are. No right or wrong. And finally, non-ubiquitous. Does that mean that information isn't just randomly scattered throughout an organism?
Exactly. It's non-ubiquitous in a couple of ways. First, not every trait or feature of an animal or a cell carries this kind of meaningful information. Like the exact shade of blue on a beetle's wing might just be due to its pigments, not because it's signaling something. And second, even the traits that do carry information, they're only about specific things. A monkey's alarm call for a snake doesn't also tell you if there's ripe fruit around.
Right, it's targeted information. So we've got these three characteristics: asymmetric, normative, non-ubiquitous. For a philosopher, these probably ring some bells, right?
They do. I mean, think about it. One-way directionality, the possibility of being right or wrong, the focus on specific content. It's all very reminiscent of philosophical concepts like intentionality or meaning. It naturally makes you wonder if biological information might be a way that meaning arises in the natural world.
That's a fascinating idea. All right, so we've laid some groundwork for how biologists often describe this intrinsic kind of information. Now, the big question is, how do we actually define information in a way that captures these features and helps us understand its role in biology? The Stanford Encyclopedia then moves on to Claude Shannon and his mathematical theory of information. Now, I know for a lot of people, information theory sounds kind of intimidating, like equations and diagrams. But what's the basic idea here, and why is it relevant to our discussion about biology, especially for a philosopher interested in meaning?
So Shannon came up with his theory back in the 1940s, and it actually started with a practical problem in communication. How do you send messages efficiently and reliably when there's noise? His solution was super abstract, super mathematical. He imagined this scenario with a source making a message, a sender encoding it, a channel that could mess things up, and then a receiver decoding it. The goal was to design codes that would let the receiver get the original message even with the noise.
So it's all about making sure communication works even when there's a chance for errors. How does information itself fit into this mathematical world?
In Shannon's theory, the amount of information is all about how much uncertainty there is, how much entropy. For our philosophy fans out there, think of entropy as a measure of how many different states a system can be in. If a system has lots of equally likely states, it has high entropy and, according to Shannon, a high capacity for information. Information then is seen as reducing this uncertainty. And from this idea of entropy, Shannon developed this crucial concept called mutual information, which tells you how much knowing one thing tells you about another. Like how much knowing what the sender sent reduces your uncertainty about the original message. The more mutual information, the more reliably you can get the message. This whole framework relies on statistical correlations between the source and the signal. That's why it's often called correlational information.
So if we see statistical links between, say, a certain gene and a disease, or a particular alarm call and a predator showing up, then we can say there's definitely Shannon information there.
Absolutely. Genes, alarm calls, brain activity, they all show these statistical patterns with other events. So in a purely statistical way, they do carry information according to Shannon. But, and this is really important for our philosophical journey, a lot of thinkers don't believe this purely mathematical statistical idea fully captures what biologists mean when they talk about information in that more intuitive way, the way that involves meaning and instructions.
Right, because those features we talked about before, the asymmetry, the normativity, the non-ubiquity, those don't seem to be built into Shannon information.
Exactly. First off, Shannon information is inherently symmetrical. If event A gives you information about event B, meaning their probabilities are linked statistically, then event B also gives you the same amount of information about event A. But remember, biological information often seems to go in one direction. Second, Shannon information isn't inherently normative. It's based on how things are statistically. There's no built-in idea of one correlation being right and another being wrong. And third, Shannon information is pretty much everywhere. Any two things that are statistically linked, even in a trivial way, carry Shannon information. That doesn't fit with the idea that biological information is about specific things and has specific content.
So just using Shannon's ideas doesn't seem to capture some of the key ways biologists use the word information, especially when they're explaining things like genetic instructions or the meaning of animal signals. That's why the encyclopedia distinguishes between Shannon information, which is about correlations, and semantic information, which is more about meaning, which is what we've been focusing on from a philosophical angle.
But it's not a simple dead end. People have recognized these issues and have tried to bridge the gap, to tweak or expand Shannon's theory to better account for those trickier aspects of biological information.
So trying to bring the math and the meaning together. How have researchers tried to do that?
Well, some folks have questioned whether we even need to separate Shannon and semantic information so strictly. They argue that if we look at Shannon's framework in a more nuanced way, like considering the context or the goals of the communication, we might already find hints of semantic content within it. Others have come up with fancier correlational approaches that go beyond just mutual information. These might involve Bayesian reasoning, looking at how probabilities change and what beliefs are formed when you receive a signal. Or they might combine Shannon information with measures of complexity to capture the idea that biological information is about specific things, not just random correlations. One cool line of research explores how interventions in a system affect Shannon information flow. If you can change one component and see predictable effects on another, that might suggest a more directed informational relationship.
That idea of interventions, that seems like a promising way to get at that sense of directionality that we see in biology.
It does. Now, switching gears a bit, another powerful approach to information in biology, one that has deep connections to philosophy, comes from evolutionary game theory, specifically the idea of signaling games.
Signaling games. That sounds like it could be insightful, especially for someone interested in how meaning evolves. How do those work?
Basically, signaling games are like simplified models with at least two players, a sender and a receiver. The world can be in different states, and the sender sees the actual state. Based on that, the sender chooses to send a specific signal. Now, the receiver sees the signal but doesn't directly know the state of the world. The receiver then takes some action based on the signal. The outcome or the payoff for both players depends on the receiver's action and the actual state of the world. Because both players have choices to make, they can evolve different strategies over time to try and get the best outcomes for themselves.
So it's a way to model how communication and responses might evolve through natural selection, even without assuming the players are conscious or understand things like we do.
Exactly. And what's powerful about these models is that they show how communication systems, where signals are reliably linked to states of the world and trigger appropriate responses, can evolve even without assuming any intelligence on the part of the players. It's been shown that under certain evolutionary pressures, you can get stable signaling systems emerging just from the dynamics of the game. These models also give us a different way to define what information a signal carries. For example, the philosopher Brian Skirms has a measure where the informational content of a signal is represented as a vector. This vector shows how much the signal changes the receiver's beliefs about the different possible states of the world. It's not just about the raw statistical correlation, but about how the signal actually updates what the receiver believes.
So the signal isn't just passively correlated with the state of the world. It actively changes the receiver's internal model of what's going on.
Exactly. And this approach has had a big impact on how we think about the evolution of communication. But of course, it has its critics. Some folks argue that while these models are great for understanding how signaling systems arise, they don't really capture the feeling of information flow or meaning. Others make a distinction between what a signal tells you about the world, which they call informational content, and what the signal actually does in the interaction, which they call functional content. There are even approaches that bring in counterfactuals, thinking about what would have happened if the world were different, which can be helpful when dealing with things like deception.
So even with these rigorous game theory models, there's still no single agreed-upon definition of what information is.
That's a key takeaway. We've got all these different statistical and model-based concepts of information, and people have different views on which one, if any, really captures the essence of biological information. Some folks champion a specific approach as the most fundamental, while others think we need multiple concepts to handle different biological phenomena. And then there are those who remain unconvinced that any purely statistical approach can account for that intuitive understanding of biological information with its asymmetry, normativity, and non-ubiquity. Plus, let's not forget that these are simplified models. Real-world interactions are much messier, so there are questions about how well these findings apply to actual biological systems.
Right. So we've explored these correlational and game theoretic approaches. Next, the Stanford Encyclopedia delves into what they call teleological approaches. Now, to a philosopher, teleological screams purpose and function. How does that connect to biological information?
You got it. Teleological approaches try to base biological information on the idea of biological function. The thinking is that function itself has some of those key features we associate with meaningful information. For example, functions have this built-in normativity. A heart is supposed to pump blood. If it doesn't, we say it's malfunctioning. Functions also tend to be asymmetrical. Blinking helps keep your eye moist, but keeping your eye moist isn't the primary function of blinking, and functions aren't everywhere. Only certain traits of organisms have specific functions.
So the idea is that maybe the aboutness and the rightness or wrongness of biological information can be explained by looking at the purpose or the function of the signal or the thing carrying the information.
That's the core idea. We could try to understand carrying semantic information as having a biological function itself. For example, the function of an alarm call is to warn other members of the group about danger. If there's no danger, the call fails to do its job accurately, which is a bit like a false statement. However, the encyclopedia points out that this simple equation doesn't quite work. Lots of biological traits have functions, like a kidney filtering waste, but they don't seem to involve information in any meaningful way.
Right. A kidney has a super important job, but it's not like it's telling you about something else the way an alarm call does. So what do these teleological approaches bring to the table to explain the difference, to address this informational aspect specifically?
Often, they bring back the idea of senders and receivers as being essential. The idea is that information arises in the context of some interaction between two or more things, either whole organisms or even just parts of organisms or mechanisms within cells. A sender picks up on something and sends a signal, and a receiver reacts based on that signal. The evolved function of this interaction, or the function of the signal within that interaction, becomes the key to defining what information is being conveyed.
So with the alarm call, the sender is the monkey that sees the snake, and the receivers are the other monkeys who react to the call. The call's function is to warn about danger, which makes them try to escape.
Exactly. But this immediately opens up a whole bunch of new questions that philosophers love to dig into, like what kinds of things can be senders and receivers? Do we always need both for information to exist? Some teleological theories emphasize the sender, defining information by what the sender evolved to signal. Others focus on the receiver, saying information is essentially determined by how the receiver is adapted to respond to a signal. And then there's the big question of what actually determines the informational content. Is it based on how the signal has been used historically and how the receiver evolved to respond, or is it mostly about how the sender produces the signal?
These are all crucial questions if we want to define information in a teleological way. And I'm guessing, since we're talking about function, these approaches run into some of the same problems that teleological explanations in biology have always faced.
You nailed it. Teleological views of biological information have a lot of the same baggage as teleological explanations in general. There are debates about how to define function, questions about whether functions are even well-defined, and then there are those classic thought experiments, like the Swapman scenario, that really challenge these ideas. Imagine a perfect molecular duplicate of a person suddenly popped into existence. Would its internal states, which are physically the same as ours, really carry information in a teleological sense, even though they have no evolutionary history? Many philosophers think that teleological theories have a hard time with these weird edge cases.
Right, because if function is all about evolution and selection, the Swapman's brain states, even if they look just like ours, wouldn't have that evolutionary background. So maybe to deal with some of these issues, we're seeing people combine the different approaches we've talked about.
That's right. The Stanford Encyclopedia points out this growing movement towards what they call hybrid accounts. These try to bring together bits from correlational theories, functional ideas, and other relevant stuff. The basic idea is that maybe neither a purely statistical nor a purely teleological approach is enough on its own to explain biological information. These hybrid views might try to show that those special features of meaningful information were actually already present in a more sophisticated version of correlation theory. Or they might explicitly include function as part of a correlational framework. It's a really active area of research, and people are really looking for a more complete picture that takes advantage of what each approach has to offer.
It sounds like there's no easy answer, with different camps emphasizing different aspects of what biological information should include. Given all this complexity, there has to be some pushback, right?
Yeah.
Are there people who question whether information is even the right way to think about these biological processes?
Definitely. The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about this as anti-realism and eliminativism about biological information. It's about whether information is a real property of biological systems, something that actually plays a causal role and helps us explain things, or if it's just a convenient but ultimately misleading or even unnecessary way of talking. And even if it is a real property, there's the question of whether it can ultimately be reduced to something more basic, like physical interactions.
So on one side, you have folks who think information is a real and crucial part of biology. On the other side, you have folks who think it might be a useful fiction or even a concept we should try to get rid of in our explanations.
That's the general idea. It's important to separate this from realism about representations, those internal mental states that are said to carry information. You could, for example, think that talking about information in insect communication is misleading, but still accept that insects produce and respond to signals. Or you could fully embrace the idea of information in biology, but be skeptical about the need for internal representations. But our focus here is on information itself, especially semantic information. Most of the approaches we've discussed lean toward a realist view, saying that semantic information is a real property that matters in biology. Many of these realists are also reductionists, hoping to eventually explain information in terms of things like correlations or functions.
But there are definitely people challenging this realist majority, right?
Oh, yeah. Some philosophers and biologists are non-reductionist realists. They think information is real and fundamental, something you can't break down into simpler terms. Others are instrumentalists. They see information as a useful tool for making predictions and understanding biology, but not necessarily as something that exists independently of our minds. And then there's this interesting idea called fictionalism. This suggests that information might be a kind of liminal metaphor, a concept that's so close to how we normally think that we might not even realize it's a metaphor, but it still plays a useful role in our understanding of biology.
That idea of a liminal metaphor, that's pretty insightful. It captures how information in biology feels like more than just a casual word choice.
It does. And running alongside these debates about whether biological information is real is the more practical question of whether we should even keep using informational language in biology. You see pockets of eliminativism in different areas, arguing that this concept might be inherently confusing or that we could explain things more clearly and accurately by focusing on other ideas. While these eliminativist views aren't super common, especially in fields like genetics and animal communication, they have gained more traction in some areas of cognitive science.
It sounds like the very idea of using information as a central concept in biology is still up for debate. Now, Stanford Encyclopedia then goes on to look specifically at two areas of biology where the concept of information has been super important and hotly debated: genetics and animal communication. Let's start with genetics, since that's arguably where this whole informational metaphor in biology really took off, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Informational concepts are so deeply ingrained in molecular biology that it's hard to imagine the field without them, from our understanding of the genetic code to this powerful idea of a genetic program guiding development. It's also deeply intertwined with fundamental principles like the central dogma of molecular biology and all those debates about the role of genes in shaping traits and inheritance.
And even the term gene itself is trickier than it seems, like the encyclopedia points out. We have the classic idea of a gene as something that's passed down and influences a trait, and then we have the more specific molecular definition of a gene as a particular stretch of DNA. These different ways of thinking about genes must have some impact on how we understand the information they carry.
For sure. Whether you mainly think of a gene as a functional unit defined by its effects on an organism or as a specific DNA sequence can lead to different interpretations of what we mean by information. But to keep things clear, let's focus on why we even say genes carry information in the first place. The main reason is their role in development, how a single fertilized egg becomes a whole organism, and their role in passing traits down through generations. The core molecular processes of transcription and translation, where information from DNA is copied into RNA and then used to make proteins, are described using information language from the get-go. The genetic code itself, that elegant system that connects triplets of bases in RNA to specific amino acids, seems like a prime example of information being encoded and decoded. And the fact that this code is combinatorial, meaning you can get a huge number of codons from a limited set of bases, and that the link between codons and amino acids is often seen as somewhat arbitrary, meaning other mappings could have worked just as well, makes this idea of genes as information carriers even stronger.
And then there's the central dogma of molecular biology, that fundamental principle saying that information generally flows from DNA to RNA to protein, not the other way around. This seems to have really solidified this informational view of genes, suggesting a one-way flow of instructions of the genes to the rest of the cell.
Exactly. And this central dogma has even been used in arguments against the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The idea being that if something in the environment changes an organism during its lifetime, those changes, if they happen at the protein level, can't be incorporated back into the DNA to be passed on because the information mostly flows one way. So, this concept of genetic information isn't just a descriptive tool, it ties into some very basic assumptions and principles in biology. But, as the encyclopedia points out, it's super important to distinguish between saying that genes carry information, which seems pretty well supported by molecular biology, and saying that this means genes have a special privileged role in development and inheritance compared to other factors. These two claims are often lumped together, but logically they're separate. You could argue that genes carry information without believing they're the only or even the most important factor in shaping an organism. And conversely, you could acknowledge the central role of genes without emphasizing their informational aspects.
Right. You could agree that genes are like the blueprints, but that doesn't mean the blueprints alone are enough to build a house. You still need the builders, the materials, the environment. So, given how important this idea of informational genes is, what kinds of criticisms has it faced?
Well, there have been several big criticisms from both philosophers and biologists. One major concern is that by focusing so much on genes as carriers of information, we might downplay or miss the contributions of other things that are equally important for development. Genes start to look like the master controllers. With everything else, the cytoplasm, the cellular environment, signals from outside the cell relegated to just carrying out the instructions in the DNA. Critics say this is a bit like preformationism, that old idea that organisms develop from tiny preformed versions of themselves that just get bigger. Instead of giving us a complete picture of development, which is a complex and dynamic process, this informational view can sometimes make it seem like the instructions in the DNA are all you need, which hides all the intricate interactions going on.
So, the worry is that this powerful information metaphor while useful, might lead to an oversimplified and maybe incomplete picture of how organisms develop.
Exactly. This idea of genes as the primary information carriers has also been linked to the whole nature versus nurture debate, with genes often representing the nature side. Developmental systems theory, or DST, has been a really influential framework for challenging this gene-centric view of development and inheritance.
DST and the parity thesis. This is where people argue that genes aren't the only or even necessarily the most important thing in development, and that other factors should be given equal weight, right?
Exactly. DST argues that all the different things involved in development, from the DNA sequence to the cell structure to the environment outside the organism, should be considered equally important when it comes to their effects. They acknowledge that genes are crucial, but they emphasize that lots of other things, like epigenetic modifications, which are heritable changes in gene expression that don't involve changes to the DNA sequence itself, the cytoplasm, and a whole range of environmental influences, also play essential roles in shaping the organism. Also, DST theorists like Richard Lewontin have questioned the idea that we can neatly separate the effects of genes and environment on a trait, arguing that they're often so intertwined that trying to separate them is artificial and misleading.
So DST gives us a much more integrated view of development, where genes are seen as one important part of a system, not as the sole source of information or control.
That's a good summary. And this parity thesis has definitely sparked a lot of debate. Some researchers who still focus on the informational role of genes have responded by saying, okay, genes are one cause among many, but they still have unique features, especially their ability to be copied and passed down really accurately that make them special, maybe in terms of their informational contribution. Others focus on the functions of inheritance systems, arguing that only these systems, which include DNA, can carry meaningful information as part of their evolved function. A challenge for DST has been to explain in a clear and meaningful way how genes and these other developmental factors are truly on par without downplaying the special properties of genetic material. Interestingly, some of the big names in DST have shifted their views a bit in recent years, recognizing a more distinct role for nucleic acids as a template for making proteins and as a key innovation for reliably transferring specific developmental factors across generations.
So even within the critical camp, there seems to be more nuanced appreciation for what genes specifically contribute in development. Now, given these criticisms of a purely gene-centric view, how have the people who advocate for informational approaches in genetics responded? How have they refined their ideas?
There have been a few different strategies. Some researchers admit that a purely Shannon-based view of genetic information isn't enough, especially if you're trying to say genes have this special explanatory role. They've shifted to emphasizing the specificity or the detailed causal profile of genetic material. The idea is that genes have a very specific and predictable effect on what happens at the molecular level in the cell, and this level of specificity can be seen as a form of information, particularly when you analyze it through the lens of interventions. In other words, if you change a gene in a specific way, you reliably see specific changes in the organism's development or physiology. Others have gone for a more explicitly teleological approach to genetic information, arguing that the evolved functions of genes within this whole developmental system are key to understanding their informational role. Unlike simple statistical correlations, biological functions aren't everywhere, and they have this inherent rightness or wrongness. A gene is supposed to be transcribed and translated correctly.
So they're trying to ground this idea of genetic information in something more than just statistics or a vague metaphor.
Right. And then there's Eva Jablonka's view, which is focused on the receiver. She says that the information content of a gene isn't something it has on its own, but is given to it by the cellular machinery that's evolved to read and respond to the genetic sequence. So genes are crucial because of their sequence, but they don't necessarily have some privileged informational status by themselves. Kim Stearney and others have focused on the informational role of genes in inheritance, arguing that while genes aren't the only thing that determines development, their ability to be copied and passed down so accurately makes them especially good for carrying information across generations. Peter Godfrey Smith has also explored how tricky it is to define information when it comes to genes, pointing out the challenges of using those sender-receiver models at the molecular level. Whether you can even accurately call cellular mechanism senders and receivers is still being debated.
That sender-receiver framework seems to keep coming up when we're talking about biological information at different levels.
It really does. And then there's this whole issue of arbitrariness in the genetic code, the fact that the connection between codons and amino acids is largely conventional, not dictated by chemistry. This arbitrariness is often used to support the idea of genes carrying symbolic information. But even how we define and understand this arbitrariness is debated. Some researchers argue it's not as unique to the genetic code as people claim, and that it's surprisingly hard to define what arbitrariness means in this context.
It seems like even in genetics, where this idea of information is so well established, there's a lot of disagreement about what genetic information really means, what makes it special, and whether it justifies saying genes have this unique explanatory power in development and inheritance.
Absolutely. And lastly, the encyclopedia mentions a few other key distinctions when it comes to genetic information. These include the difference between proximate information, which is about the immediate molecular products like proteins, versus ultimate information.